The foul smell wafting from apartment 213 wasn't just the stench of decay, it was a macabre whisper of the horrors hidden behind its walls. It was late on the evening of July 22nd, 1991, when Milwaukee police officers Joseph Gabrish and John Balcerzak responded to a call that seemed routine on the surface, but would soon lead to one of the most horrifying discoveries in criminal history. Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, had flagged down officers on the street, visibly shaken and partially dressed. His eyes darted around nervously, his wrists bearing the faint marks of handcuffs. His story was as bizarre as it was chilling. Edwards claimed he had just escaped from an apartment where the tenant had attempted to restrain and kill him. He spoke of how the man, who introduced himself as Jeff, had lured him inside with promises of drinks and casual conversation. What began as an ordinary evening had quickly devolved into a nightmare. Edwards recounted how Jeff had tried to handcuff him and brandished a knife while making disturbing threats. In a desperate bid to save himself, Edwards had managed to gain his captor's trust long enough to plot an escape. At the first opportunity, he fled the apartment, running barefoot into the street and crying for help. The officers listened with growing concern as Edwards pointed them to the location of his ordeal, apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments. The building, nestled in a quiet corner of Milwaukee, appeared unremarkable from the outside. The door to the apartment stood slightly ajar, and an unsettling odor wafted out. When the officers knocked, the man who answered seemed strangely composed. Jeffrey Dahmer, a tall, thin man with soft-spoken manners, greeted them with a forced smile. He looked harmless, almost unassuming. His demeanor was polite, even cooperative, as he assured the officers there had been a misunderstanding. "What's going on here?" Officer Gabrish asked, his tone firm yet probing. Dahmer spoke quickly, explaining that Edwards was a guest who had overreacted during a personal disagreement. His explanation seemed plausible enough, but the officers couldn't ignore the unease that hung in the air like a thick fog. Then there was the smell. The stench was overpowering, an acrid blend of decay and chemical cleaners that seemed to emanate from deeper within the apartment. It was the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat, forcing your mind to consider dark possibilities. "Mind if we take a look around?" Balcerzak asked, his hand resting instinctively on the holster of his sidearm. Dahmer hesitated, his eyes darting toward the bedroom as if weighing his options. It was a brief moment, barely noticeable, but it was enough to raise suspicions. "Sure," he finally replied, stepping aside to let them in. As the officers entered, the odor grew stronger. The small, cluttered apartment was dimly lit, its walls adorned with posters and photos that seemed ordinary at first glance. But there were oddities: bottles of cleaning supplies stacked in unusual quantities, a large blue barrel tucked in the corner, and a refrigerator that hummed ominously. While Officer Gabrish engaged Dahmer in conversation, Balcerzak opened the drawer of a small nightstand. Inside, he found a stack of Polaroid photographs. His breath caught in his throat as he flipped through them. The images were grotesque, depicting dismembered human bodies in various stages of decomposition. The photos left no room for doubt. They were evidence of murder, captured with a cold, calculated precision. "What is this?" Balcerzak demanded, his voice rising as he held up the photos. Dahmer's demeanor changed instantly. The calm facade crumbled, replaced by panic and desperation. He lunged at the officers, attempting to snatch the photos away, but the two men quickly subdued him. As they cuffed Dahmer, a chilling realization began to sink in. This was no ordinary crime scene. The true extent of what lay hidden in apartment 213 was something they couldn't yet fathom. Unbeknownst to the officers, they had just uncovered the lair of one of America's most prolific and sadistic serial killers, a man whose heinous acts would soon shock the world. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer's life began in the most ordinary way, offering no clear indication of the darkness that would one day consume him. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he was the first child of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. To those who knew the family, They seemed unremarkable. A hard-working father studying chemistry and a mother trying to adjust to her new role as a parent. But behind the picket fences of suburban life, trouble was brewing. Joyce Dahmer suffered from mental health issues, often described as erratic and needy, while Lionel was consumed by his academic pursuits. This left young Jeffrey caught in the middle, a lonely child yearning for attention and stability. From an early age, Jeffrey exhibited behaviors that, in hindsight, now seem like glaring red flags. As a toddler, he was curious and bright, but by the time he reached grade school, his demeanor had changed. He became withdrawn, preferring solitude over social interaction. Teachers described him as quiet and well-mannered, but his peers often ignored him, finding him strange. At the age of 4, Jeffrey underwent a hernia surgery that seemed to mark a turning point in his personality. Family members noted that he became more subdued and distant. He started showing a peculiar fascination with death, a fascination that would later define his life. By the time Jeffrey was in middle school, his odd interests began to take shape. He became obsessed with animals, not out of love, but curiosity. He would collect roadkill and dissect the carcasses in the woods behind his house, a macabre hobby that he rationalized as scientific inquiry. Lionel, recognizing his son's interest in anatomy, showed him how to bleach animal bones to preserve them. Though Lionel likely intended this as a bonding moment, it inadvertently encouraged Jeffrey's growing fixation on the macabre. At school, Jeffrey became a class clown, using humor to mask his insecurities and loneliness. He often performed strange antics, like faking seizures or mimicking teachers, earning him fleeting attention but not genuine friendship. His classmates nicknamed these behaviors "doing a Dahmer." Despite these efforts to fit in, his isolation deepened. By high school, he had turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism. He smuggled beer and hard liquor into class, concealing it in a thermos. His drinking became so frequent that his classmates assumed he was always intoxicated. While Jeffrey struggled socially and emotionally, his home life was falling apart. Joyce and Lionel's marriage was plagued by constant arguments, often escalating into shouting matches that Jeffrey could hear from his room. Joyce's mental health deteriorated further, leading to episodes of paranoia and instability. Lionel, on the other hand, buried himself in his work, leaving Jeffrey to navigate this chaos largely on his own. When Jeffrey was 18, his parents divorced. Lionel moved out, leaving Jeffrey and his younger brother, David, with Joyce. Shortly after, Joyce decided to relocate with David, but she left Jeffrey behind. Alone in the family home, abandoned by both parents, Jeffrey found himself completely untethered, a dangerous situation for someone already harboring dark thoughts. In the summer of 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He was living alone when he encountered Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker looking for a ride to a rock concert. Dahmer offered him a ride, but instead of taking Hicks to his destination, he invited him back to his house for drinks. Initially, the two bonded over shared interests in music and conversation. However, when Hicks decided it was time to leave, something snapped in Dahmer. Desperate to keep Hicks from abandoning him, he grabbed a dumbbell and struck him from behind, killing him. What followed was a gruesome initiation into the world of murder. Dahmer dismembered Hicks's body in the basement, using the knowledge he had gained from dissecting animals. He packed the remains into garbage bags and, under the cover of night, drove them to a wooded area where he buried them. Years later, Dahmer would confess that this murder left him feeling both exhilarated and terrified. The act of killing had momentarily satisfied his desire for control, but it also awakened a darker side he struggled to suppress. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Dahmer's life entered a strange period of dormancy. He enrolled at Ohio State University but dropped out after one semester due to poor grades and his escalating alcoholism. In 1979, he joined the U.S. Army, where he trained as a medical specialist. While his military service brought structure to his life, his troubling behaviors persisted. He was reprimanded for drinking and eventually discharged in 1981. Returning to Ohio, Dahmer briefly lived with his father before moving to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. During this time, Dahmer managed to suppress his homicidal urges, but his inner turmoil remained, festering beneath the surface. He frequented gay bars and bathhouses, exploring his sexuality, but also grappling with feelings of shame and alienation. It wasn't until 1987, nearly a decade after his first murder, that Dahmer's violent tendencies resurfaced. The beast within had lain dormant for years, but now it was awakening, and it was hungrier than ever. By 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer's carefully controlled facade began to crumble. The urges he had fought to suppress for nearly a decade were now impossible to ignore. Living with his grandmother in Milwaukee, he led a double life. By day, a quiet and unassuming man who kept to himself, and by night, a predator prowling the city for victims. In November 1987, Dahmer's second known victim crossed his path. Stephen Tuomi, a 24-year-old man, met Dahmer at a bar in Milwaukee. The two spent the evening drinking and talking before Dahmer convinced Tuomi to return to his hotel room for more drinks. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, even in Dahmer's own recollections. He claimed that he didn't plan to kill Tuomi and blacked out from heavy drinking. When he awoke the next morning, Tuomi's lifeless body was lying beside him, battered and bruised. Rather than panicking, Dahmer methodically cleaned up the scene. He purchased a large suitcase to transport the body back to his grandmother's home. There, he dismembered Tuomi's corpse, dissolving the flesh in acid and smashing the bones into powder. He discarded the remains in the trash, effectively erasing any trace of Tuomi's existence. This murder marked a turning point for Dahmer. Unlike the impulsive killing of Stephen Hicks, this time he began to refine his methods. Each subsequent crime would be meticulously planned, reflecting his growing confidence and the depths of his depravity. Over the next few years, Dahmer's killings escalated, both in frequency and brutality. He targeted young men, many of them from marginalized communities, luring them back to his apartment with promises of money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside, Dahmer's victims were drugged and rendered unconscious. He experimented with various methods to control them, including drilling holes in their skulls and injecting chemicals into their brains. His goal was to create zombies who would remain alive but entirely submissive to his will. The horrifying reality was that Dahmer's crimes were not solely about killing. He sought total domination over his victims, both in life and death. He kept body parts as trophies, skulls, bones, and even entire torsos, which he stored in his apartment alongside gruesome Polaroid photos documenting the murders. Neighbors began to notice strange things. The smell emanating from Dahmer's apartment was nearly unbearable, a sickening combination of decay and chemicals. He explained it away as spoiled meat or a broken freezer. Despite these red flags, no one intervened. The police, too, failed to connect the dots. In one chilling incident, a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthosamphone managed to escape Dahmer's apartment. Naked and disoriented, the boy was found by two women who called the police. When Dahmer arrived on the scene, he convinced the officers that Konorak was his boyfriend and that they had simply had an argument. In a shocking lapse of judgment, the officers returned Konorak to Dahmer's custody. The boy was murdered later that night. This grotesque combination of societal neglect, police oversight, and Dahmer's manipulative charm allowed his killing spree to continue unchecked. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer had become what seemed to be an untouchable predator. Operating in plain sight, he lived a life of inconspicuous routine by day, while indulging in his grotesque compulsions by night. His ability to evade detection wasn't just a result of his cunning and manipulation. It was a failure of the systems and individuals around him to notice or act on glaring red flags. This chapter explores the chilling interplay between Dahmer's actions, societal indifference, systemic shortcomings, and his victims' vulnerability. It highlights how these elements coalesced into a perfect storm, allowing one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history to operate with near impunity. Dahmer's chosen hunting grounds were gay bars, bathhouses, and the streets of Milwaukee. Many of his victims were young men of color, often struggling with homelessness or other vulnerabilities. For Dahmer, these factors made them ideal targets. They were less likely to be missed, their disappearances less likely to draw immediate attention. He approached his victims with calculated charm, often offering money, alcohol, or companionship. His demeanor was non-threatening, even shy, which disarmed his targets. In hindsight, this was part of his lethal efficiency. Dahmer didn't need to overpower his victims through sheer force. He used manipulation and deceit to lure them into his trap. Once inside his apartment, Dahmer's victims were drugged with drinks laced with sleeping pills. As they drifted into unconsciousness, they were entirely at his mercy. Dahmer's methods of murder were cold and methodical, and his fascination with control extended far beyond the act of killing. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dahmer's story is how many opportunities authorities had to intervene, but failed. These failures weren't just oversights, they were systemic issues rooted in prejudice, negligence, and a lack of accountability. The Konarak synthesomphone case, the most glaring example of police incompetence, occurred in May 1991. Konarak, a 14-year-old boy, had been drugged and sexually assaulted by Dahmer. Somehow, he managed to escape and was found wandering the streets, naked and incoherent. Two concerned women called the police, urging them to intervene. When the officers arrived, Dahmer appeared on the scene and calmly explained that Konarak was his boyfriend, claiming they had an argument. Despite the women's protests and the boys' clear distress, the officers accepted Dahmer's explanation. They even escorted Konarak back to his apartment, where he would be killed just hours later. The officers, John Balcerzak and Joseph Gebrish, failed to perform a basic background check on Dahmer. If they had, they would have discovered his criminal record, including a 1988 conviction for sexually assaulting Konarak's older brother. Police bias, homophobia, and racism played significant roles in Dahmer's ability to evade capture. Many of his victims were Black, Latino, or Asian, groups that were already marginalized and often overlooked by law enforcement. Dahmer's calm demeanor and ability to present himself as a normal white man worked to his advantage, while the voices of his victims and witnesses were dismissed. Dahmer's ability to appear ordinary was one of his greatest weapons. He was known as a quiet, polite individual who kept to himself. Neighbors at the Oxford apartments noticed the stench emanating from his unit and heard strange noises, but they hesitated to confront him directly. When they did, Dahmer offered plausible excuses: spoiled meat, a broken refrigerator, or his experiments with taxidermy. Dahmer's job as a chocolate factory worker added to his unassuming image. He worked regular shifts and maintained a routine that gave no outward signs of his double life. To his co-workers, he seemed odd but harmless, a loner who didn't socialize much. Dahmer's manipulation extended beyond his victims to the very systems meant to protect them. He was adept at exploiting societal prejudices, often playing on stereotypes to avoid scrutiny. The victim's vulnerabilities. Dahmer deliberately chose victims whose lives were already marked by instability. Many were estranged from their families, battling addiction, or struggling to make ends meet. When these individuals disappeared, their absences were often chalked up to transient lifestyles. The legal system. Dahmer's 1988 conviction for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old boy could have ended his killing spree before it began in earnest. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison, but was released after serving just 10 months. The leniency of this sentence, combined with a lack of follow-up supervision, allowed Dahmer to continue his descent into darkness. Dahmer's neighbors at the Oxford apartments had growing suspicions about his behavior. Glenda Cleveland, a woman who lived nearby, repeatedly called the police to report strange smells and noises coming from his apartment. Her concerns were largely ignored. One neighbor, Pamela Bass, later recounted how she once ate a sandwich Dahmer offered her. The chilling possibility that it contained human remains haunted her for years. Even as the walls of his life began to close in, Dahmer remained eerily composed. He knew how to deflect suspicion and manipulate those around him, ensuring that his crimes remained hidden. Dahmer's ability to evade capture for so long raises uncomfortable questions about the societal and systemic failures that enabled his crimes. Racism, homophobia, and classism created a perfect storm of neglect, allowing him to target vulnerable individuals with little fear of consequence. Had law enforcement taken the concerns of neighbors like Glenda Cleveland seriously, or had they listened to the women who found Konarak's synthesome phone, countless lives could have been saved. But these voices were dismissed, leaving Dahmer free to continue his killing spree. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had murdered 17 young men and boys, each death a horrifying testament to his ability to evade detection. He operated in a city filled with people, yet no one truly saw him. His victims disappeared into the shadows, their voices silenced by a society that failed to protect them. Dahmer's untouchable status wasn't just a product of his cunning. It was a reflection of the systemic failures that allowed him to prey on the vulnerable without fear of justice. It wasn't until Tracy Edwards escaped in July 1991 that Dahmer's reign of terror finally came to an end, exposing the horrific truth of his crimes. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had perfected his methods. His apartment at the Oxford Apartments had become a killing factory, a place where human lives ended in unspeakable ways. In May of that year, Dahmer met Tony Hughes, a 31-year-old deaf man. Using a written note to communicate, Dahmer lured Hughes back to his apartment. There, he murdered him and left his body in the apartment for several days before dismembering it. Soon after, Dahmer encountered 20-year-old Konarak synthesome phone, whose tragic story epitomized the system's failure to stop Dahmer. After drugging and assaulting the boy, Dahmer left him briefly while he went to buy alcohol. During that time, Konarak managed to flee the apartment, leading to the infamous encounter with the police. The bodies were piling up, but Dahmer remained undetected. His apartment was a grotesque gallery of his crimes. The refrigerator contained severed heads, while the freezer housed human hearts and other organs that he intended to eat. The blue barrel in the corner was used to dissolve body parts in acid, and the walls were lined with Polaroid photos of his victims in various stages of death and dismemberment. The trial of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was one of the most sensational and emotionally charged criminal cases in American history. By the time his trial commenced in January 1992, Dahmer's name had become synonymous with horror, depravity, and the unimaginable. This chapter explores the legal proceedings, the reactions of his victims' families, the defense's strategy, and the profound societal implications of the trial. When Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in July 1991, the evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. His apartment was a macabre scene. Photographs of dismembered bodies, severed heads in the refrigerator, and human remains in acid-filled vats. With such irrefutable proof of his crimes, Dahmer initially waived his right to legal representation during police interrogations, confessing in chilling detail to the murder and dismemberment of 17 men and boys. His confessions, however, did not absolve the legal system of the need for a trial. The court proceedings would determine whether Dahmer would be held criminally responsible for his actions or deemed insane, a verdict that could mean the difference between life imprisonment and institutionalization in a mental facility. Dahmer's legal team, led by Gerald Boyle, built their case around an insanity defense. They argued that Dahmer's crimes were not the actions of a rational person, but of a man plagued by severe mental illness. Boyle emphasized the grotesque and ritualistic nature of Dahmer's crimes as evidence of his psychological disorders. Necrophilia. Dahmer admitted to having sexual relations with his victims' corpses, a fact that Boyle argued indicated an uncontrollable compulsion rather than rational intent. Cannibalism. The act of consuming his victim's flesh was portrayed as evidence of a mind completely detached from reality, creating zombies. Dahmer's bizarre attempts to render his victims into living but submissive zombies through drilling holes in their skulls and injecting them with acid were presented as symptoms of delusional thinking. Boyle claimed that Dahmer's inability to control these compulsions and his twisted attempts to keep his victims with him forever proved his insanity. He brought in expert witnesses, including psychiatrists and psychologists, who testified that Dahmer suffered from multiple psychological disorders, including borderline personality disorder, psychotic tendencies, and necrophilic fantasies. The prosecution, led by Michael McCann, countered the insanity defense by arguing that Dahmer was fully aware of the criminal nature of his actions. They sought to prove that he was methodical, calculated, and entirely sane during his killing spree. Key points of the prosecution's argument included planning and concealment. Dahmer meticulously planned his crimes, from luring victims to his apartment to disposing of their remains. He took steps to avoid detection, such as soundproofing his apartment and using chemicals to dissolve bodies, indicating a clear understanding of the illegality of his actions. Confession and cooperation. During his confession, Dahmer showed a detailed recollection of his crimes and expressed regret. The prosecution argued that this demonstrated his capacity to understand the moral and legal implications of his actions. Manipulation. Dahmer's ability to manipulate his victims and, in some cases, law enforcement, as with the Konarak synthesomphone case, was presented as evidence of his mental acuity rather than insanity. The prosecution called its own expert witnesses, who testified that while Dahmer's crimes were undoubtedly depraved, they did not stem from psychosis or a loss of reality. Instead, they argued his actions were the result of extreme selfishness and a desire for control. The courtroom was a charged environment. Family members of Dahmer's victims filled the seats, each day bringing new and gruesome revelations about their loved ones' final moments. Many wept openly as they listened to the details of the killings, while others expressed anger and frustration at the failures of the justice system that had allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes for so long. During victim impact statements, families spoke directly to Dahmer. Their words were searing, expressing a mix of grief, rage, and bewilderment. Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, gave a fiery and emotional statement that captured the pain of the victims' families. Screaming at Dahmer, she expressed her devastation at losing her brother and the horror of what he had endured. The synthesomphone family, who had already suffered when Dahmer sexually assaulted their son in 1988, expressed their anguish over the murder of 14-year-old Konarak and the police's failure to protect him. The courtroom atmosphere often boiled over with raw emotion, and the judge had to call for order multiple times. Throughout the trial, Dahmer maintained a calm and detached demeanor. He rarely showed any visible emotion, even as graphic evidence and harrowing testimonies were presented. However, Dahmer did make an unusual move during the trial. He pleaded guilty but insane to all charges. This was seen as an acknowledgement of his guilt, but he maintained that his mental state absolved him of full responsibility. In a rare moment of expression, Dahmer delivered a statement near the end of the trial, apologizing to the families of his victims. He said, "I'm so very sorry for what I did to your loved ones. I didn't know how to stop myself. I didn't take pleasure in causing them pain. I only wanted to keep them with me. I wish I could bring them back, but I can't. I hope God will forgive me, and I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me too." While his apology may have been genuine, Many found it hollow and self-serving in light of the horrors he had inflicted. On February 17, 1992, after 2 weeks of testimony and 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty on 15 counts of first-degree murder. The insanity defense was rejected, with the jury concluding that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. The trial's conclusion was met with mixed reactions. While many were relieved that Dahmer would spend the rest of his life behind bars, there was lingering anger and frustration over how he had managed to evade capture for so long. The case highlighted systemic failures in law enforcement, particularly the neglect and discrimination faced by marginalized communities. It also forced a reckoning with broader societal issues, such as homophobia, racism, and the stigmatization of mental illness. Jeffrey Dahmer's life after his conviction was marked by isolation, attempts at redemption, and ultimately, a violent end that reflected the brutality of his crime. While justice had been served in the legal sense, Dahmer's presence in the prison system and his death raised questions about the limits of retribution, forgiveness, and the human capacity for change. After being sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in February 1992, Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. As a notorious and reviled serial killer, he was placed under maximum security to prevent potential attacks from other inmates. For the first year of his incarceration, Dahmer was kept in solitary confinement for his own protection. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, with only 1 hour allotted for exercise. Prison guards monitored him closely, aware that his crimes had made him a target. Despite his isolation, Dahmer's notoriety followed him even behind bars. Other inmates were aware of his crimes, and many harbored intense hatred for him. The media's coverage of his case ensured that he remained a figure of public fascination and revulsion. In prison, Dahmer exhibited what some perceived as remorse for his actions. He became deeply religious, spending hours reading the Bible and attending weekly prayer sessions. In May 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister from the Churches of Christ. The ceremony took place in the prison's whirlpool, symbolizing Dahmer's attempt to wash away his sins. Dahmer claimed that he had found peace in religion, and he often spoke of his desire to atone for his actions. In interviews, he expressed regret for the pain he had caused, though many doubted the sincerity of his remorse. His conversion and baptism sparked controversy. Some saw it as a genuine attempt at redemption, while others viewed it as a hollow gesture, incapable of compensating for the horrors he had inflicted. The families of his victims were particularly divided, with some taking solace in his newfound faith and others rejecting it outright as manipulative and self-serving. Even in prison, Dahmer's story continued to unfold. In 1993, Dahmer gave a series of interviews to journalist Nancy Glass, in which he spoke candidly about his crimes, motivations, and inner demons. "I don't know what started it," Dahmer said in one interview. "I feel it was a compulsion. It became an obsession. I couldn't stop myself." Dahmer's willingness to discuss his crimes in explicit detail offered a disturbing glimpse into his psyche. He described his overwhelming desire for control, his inability to connect with others emotionally, and the twisted logic that drove his actions. Despite his openness, many questioned whether Dahmer was genuinely seeking to help others understand his crimes, or if he was relishing the continued attention. His demeanor in interviews, calm, composed, and disturbingly matter-of-fact, left an unsettling impression. By 1994, Dahmer had requested to be removed from solitary confinement. He expressed a desire to spend his remaining years in the general prison population, stating that isolation had become unbearable. Despite concerns for his safety, his request was granted. Dahmer began participating in work detail, cleaning the prison gym and bathrooms. He interacted with other inmates, but remained a polarizing figure, detested by many for the nature of his crimes. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work alongside two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The three men were left unsupervised in a gymnasium bathroom. Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate serving a life sentence for murder, later recounted the events of that morning. Armed with a metal bar from a weightlifting set, Scarver attacked Dahmer and Anderson. He bludgeoned Dahmer repeatedly, leaving him with severe head and facial injuries. Prison guards discovered Dahmer lying on the bathroom floor, barely alive. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead an hour later. Anderson, who was also attacked, succumbed to his injuries later that day. Scarver later claimed that he had killed Dahmer because of his crimes and what he perceived as Dahmer's lack of remorse. In interviews, Scarver described feeling a divine mandate to punish the notorious serial killer. "He crossed the line with his crimes," Scarver stated. "Some things are just unforgivable." The news of Dahmer's death sent shockwaves through the public. For some, it was a fitting end for a man who had caused so much pain and suffering. Others viewed it as a failure of the prison system to protect even its most reviled inmates. The families of Dahmer's victims had mixed reactions. Some expressed relief, feeling that justice had been served in its most final form. Others, however, felt cheated of the closure they had sought through Dahmer's imprisonment and possible rehabilitation. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. However, his crimes left an enduring legacy, raising profound questions about the nature of evil, the failures of societal systems, and the fragility of human morality. Dahmer's story continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts, offering a chilling case study of how unchecked desires and systemic neglect can culminate in unspeakable atrocities. In the years following his death, debates have persisted over whether Dahmer's religious conversion was genuine, whether his trial truly delivered justice, and what lessons can be drawn from the tragedy of his life and crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer's life and death remain a haunting reminder of the consequences of ignoring the warning signs of deep psychological disturbance. His ability to operate undetected for so long exposed the vulnerabilities in a system meant to protect the most vulnerable. For the families of his victims, Dahmer's death brought an end to their nightmare, but it could never erase the pain of their loss. Their voices, full of grief and resilience, continue to echo, reminding the world of the human cost of evil. The final chapter of Jeffrey Dahmer's life may have been written, but the story of his crimes and the lives he destroyed will remain etched in history as a stark cautionary tale. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is one of unimaginable horror, but it's also a stark reminder of the human capacity for evil. The Milwaukee Cannibal will forever be remembered as one of history's most notorious serial killers. His crimes left scars not just on his victims' families, but on society itself, a haunting legacy that lingers long after his death.